Samuel Tracy didn't buy the lakeside property for the view, though it was decent. He didn't buy it for peace and quiet either, not in the way people usually mean that. He wasn't after some fantasy of morning coffee with birdsong or romantic fishing off the dock. He wanted distance, not tranquility. Distance from the city, from people who talk too much and mean too little, from memory. The property had been cheap, just isolated enough, and had a battered wooden pier stretching 20 feet into a calm, man-made lake that used to serve as a reservoir decades ago before the county let it become a residential patch of shoreline homes. His cottage was modest, one story with peeling paint and sagging gutters, but it had a garage large enough for a lift, solid bones, and a slip in the shoreline deed that gave him full access to the water, unlike some of the newer homes in the development. That mattered. Samuel was not a man who needed to impress anyone. He worked with engines all his life, diesel mostly, and had a sharp nose for what would run, what could be revived, and what needed to be scrapped. After selling his garage in a city he no longer liked, he took the cash and left. No big announcement, no family barbecue. Just a quiet closing day, a handshake with the real estate agent, and a long solo drive out of the noise. No one missed him. That suited him just fine. The house had come with its share of issues: plumbing from the 70s, a fireplace lined with soot like it had never been cleaned, and a yard infested with weeds that grew fast and angry after every rain. Samuel didn't complain. He pulled out the roots one by one, restored the dock himself using old cedar planks from a dismantled barn he found listed for free, and began to clear out the algae in the water around his property. The work kept him grounded. Every bolt he turned, every pipe he fixed, took him further from the life he'd grown tired of. By the time he rebuilt the old sea-doo he found half-submerged near the boat ramp. Rusted, gutted, but fixable. He felt like he owned the space in more than just legal terms. It had become his. Earned, not gifted. Most mornings he spent under the carport or in the garage with the radio low, tinkering. Afternoons he took the jet ski out, never far, never recklessly, just enough to open the engine up and feel something kick beneath him that still responded to pressure and direction. There was no better throttle therapy than that. No music, no cameras, no social media posts. Just him, water, and speed. He didn't make much of the neighbors at first. People waved when they passed, nodded at the gas station, dropped pleasantries like keys. Easy to lose, not worth chasing. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just quiet. Most folks kept to themselves around the lake except for one woman. Karen Peterson. Karen lived 2 doors uphill in the largest house on the East Bank. 3 stories, white shutters, artificial lawn. The type of place with a mailbox shaped like a lighthouse and motion-activated lights that came on even if a squirrel crossed the driveway. Karen was the unofficial queen of the lake community. She'd been on the residential committee for over a decade, held monthly informal updates in her sunroom, and had laminated copies of the property guidelines ready to hand out at any interaction longer than 20 seconds. She wore wide-rimmed sunglasses in the shade, perfume that overpowered wind, and had a voice like brittle glass. Sharp, brittle, ready to cut if you pressed the wrong way. The first time Karen approached Samuel was on his 3rd week at the lake. He had just returned from a short ride on the jet ski, docked it smoothly, and was removing his gloves when he saw her walking down the slope in flats that sank with every step into the dirt. She didn't greet him. She gestured at the water behind him with a long acrylic nail and asked, without irony, "Do you have any idea how loud that thing is?" Samuel, still holding his gloves, looked back at the lake. The surface was calm, only the faintest ripples near the dock. The jet ski motor had been off for at least 4 minutes. He turned back to her and said, "It's quieter than the leaf blower you used yesterday at 7 a.m. Karen's lips tightened into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just saying, this is a peaceful neighborhood. We like to keep it that way." "I'm not stopping you," he replied evenly. "You're disrupting the ecosystem," she added, ignoring his response. There are birds that nest here. You're driving them off." "I'm pretty sure the herons left when they built your third garage," Samuel said. That was the end of that conversation. She left, but he saw her pacing along the shoreline later that afternoon, taking photos with her tablet and gesturing animatedly to someone on a phone call. After that, Samuel started noticing small changes. A printed note slipped into his mailbox with bold font and passive-aggressive tone, reminding all residents of the voluntary noise reduction etiquette. Flyers posted on the community board urging respect for shared environmental space. A folded copy of the neighborhood policy code left on his porch with sections highlighted, none of them legally binding. He didn't retaliate. He didn't escalate. He simply ignored them and kept riding, usually later in the day when fewer people were outside and the sun sat lower, orange and heavy. But Karen wasn't done. One evening, as Samuel helped a local boy named Micah check the throttle linkage on an old carbureted outboard, she appeared again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 other residents, both retirees he hadn't spoken more than 5 words to, followed a few steps behind her. Karen walked straight up to him and said, "This is not a water park. We're not running a marina here. You can't just invite children to play with dangerous machinery unsupervised." Samuel stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's supervised. By me. And this machinery isn't dangerous. It's a small-engine rebuild. Educational, actually." "Children should be reading," Karen said, "not buzzing around like insects, scaring off property values." Micah, to his credit, didn't flinch. He looked at Karen and said, "He's teaching me how to fix it, not how to ride it, and my dad says that's more useful than poetry." Samuel smiled then, just a twitch, and looked back at Karen. "If you've got a real issue, bring paperwork. Otherwise, I'm not your concern." Karen left with her entourage, but the message was clear. Lines had been drawn. In any other neighborhood, maybe this would blow over. But this lake, with its aging population, its overgrown bylaws, and its single self-declared enforcer, wasn't going to let it go. Something was coming, and Samuel knew it. He didn't want trouble, but if it came to his dock, he'd meet it chest on. He just hadn't expected it to escalate so fast. Or that the real battle wouldn't be about noise, property, or even rules. It would be about power. Who had it? Who pretended to? And what a man had to do when someone tried to take control of the one thing he owned outright: his space. It started, as these things often do, not with an explosion, but a letter. Not official, not notarized, not even mailed. Just a folded sheet of printer paper slipped into Samuel's rust-bitten mailbox one overcast Tuesday morning. No envelope, no return address. The text was printed in bold Arial font with awkward spacing, and though it lacked a signature, it was clear who authored it. The phrasing was unmistakably Karen, overly formal in tone, aggressive in implication, yet just vague enough to dodge legal accountability. The letter stated that, in response to multiple neighbor complaints, a temporary moratorium had been recommended for the use of motorized personal watercraft in the shared lake area, pending further discussion by the Community Advisory Group. That phrase alone made Samuel scoff. There was no such formal group, just Karen and a few sycophants who drank her lemonade once a month and nodded at everything she said as though it were the word of law. Nowhere in the paper was it written as a binding order, but the implication was thick enough to choke on. She was telling him, in her passive-aggressive code, to stop using the jet ski. Immediately, Samuel didn't respond. He simply folded the letter back up, tucked it under the leg of the garage workbench where it could add to the wobble support, and went about his day. The lake was empty that afternoon, the weather muggy, sky dull and low, so he took the Sea-Doo out for a short ride, cut a few turns near the buoy line, then returned without incident. He didn't push it. He wasn't trying to provoke, but he wasn't going to submit to a suggestion wrapped in fake authority either. It was a matter of principle now. The following morning, a knock came at the door. Not a gentle tap or neighborly greeting, but a persistent, deliberate series of raps. 4, then pause, then 4 more. When he opened it, a man in khakis and a city ID badge stood there, clipboard in hand, with an expression halfway between confusion and apology. "Mr. Tracy, Samuel Tracy?" the man asked. Samuel gave a single nod. The man glanced down at his paperwork and said, "We received a complaint regarding noise violations, possible unauthorized recreational activity, and environmental impact relating to your use of the lake access." He was young, maybe 30, and his tone wasn't confrontational. If anything, he seemed embarrassed to be there. "I'm with municipal compliance for non-urban zones. Normally, this kind of thing wouldn't get priority, but, well, the complaint was marked urgent." Samuel didn't bother asking who filed it. The inspector asked to see the shoreline, then the watercraft in question. Samuel walked him to the dock, gesturing with minimal commentary. The Sea-Doo sat where it always did, tied down and covered with a reinforced canvas hood. The dock itself was solid, built within code, and the adjacent shoreline was cleaner than most of the neighbors. No discarded lawn furniture, no chemical runoff from fertilizers, no trash. The inspector scribbled a few notes, took a photo, and said he'd be filing a preliminary report but saw no immediate violations. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't offer explanations. But before the inspector left, he handed him a manila folder with laminated printouts. "These are the original survey maps," Samuel said, "and this is the noise assessment I had done last month, just in case this comes back." The man looked surprised but nodded, clearly grateful not to be yelled at. He took the folder, shook Samuel's hand, and left with a promise to be in touch. As the city vehicle pulled away, Samuel stood at the edge of his property for a long minute, eyes scanning the slope where Karen's home loomed. The blinds in her upper-floor window shifted just slightly. She was watching. That evening, Samuel drove into town and ordered 5 more Sea-Doos. All older models, all in rough shape, some missing engines, others gutted by time and exposure. It cost a chunk, but not enough to hurt. He arranged for delivery over the next 2 weeks and spent the nights clearing space along the edge of his lot for a small covered area where he could store them without them being visible from the road. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't revenge. It was escalation control. A few days later, 2 local kids, Micah and his cousin Daryl, came by after school and asked if they could help rebuild one. Word was getting around, apparently. Samuel wasn't thrilled at first. He wasn't interested in becoming a mentor or running a community outreach project. But the kids were respectful, listened more than they talked, and actually showed curiosity instead of boredom. He gave them the basics: socket wrenches, labels, safety goggles, and let them strip down the simplest of the jet skis under his supervision. They worked quietly and well. No drama, no noise, just focused effort. The problems began again soon after. Samuel came home one night and noticed that the lock on the dockside storage cabinet had been pried off. Nothing was stolen, but the scratch marks on the hinge were fresh and one of the jet skis had its fuel line cleanly cut. Not slashed or torn, cut with precision. Someone had come prepared. He didn't report it. There was no evidence, no footage, and he didn't want to start throwing around accusations he couldn't back up. But it changed things. He installed a motion-activated camera with local storage and made sure it was hidden under the eaves of the dock roof. He didn't tell the kids. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. By the weekend, a new letter arrived. This one came from a law office, stationery, watermark, the whole formal layout. It was a cease and desist drafted on behalf of the Community Waterfront Preservation Coalition, alleging that Samuel's use of the lake was creating dangerous conditions for wildlife, neighborhood harmony, and property value integrity. The letter demanded that he immediately halt all watercraft operations, dismantle the dock expansion he had allegedly undertaken without approval, and present himself before a neighborhood review committee the following Tuesday. Samuel read the letter once, then again, then placed it flat on his workbench and stared at it in silence. There was no dock expansion. He had merely replaced the planks, and there was no legally recognized coalition under that name in the municipal registry. The law office was real, but the client was fictitious, most likely created by Karen or one of her friends. It was intimidation masquerading as process. That night he went online, pulled up zoning law for the area, printed out every relevant section, and highlighted the clauses that protected his right to recreational water use. He attached copies of his original property deed, the compliance inspection, and the certified noise report. Then he drafted a letter of his own, simple and clear, addressed not to the fake committee but to the law office representing them. If further action is pursued, please be advised I will seek damages for harassment, attempted misrepresentation, and malicious interference with lawful property use. He sent the whole packet by certified mail the next morning. Micah showed up that afternoon with 2 friends and asked if they could keep working on the second machine. Samuel hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Keep it respectful," he said. "No showing off, no speed trials, not yet." The kids got to work. Meanwhile, the weather turned. Clouds moved in heavy and low, and the wind began to pick up along the waterline. But Samuel knew, as did anyone raised near lakes, that sometimes the worst storms didn't break with thunder. They built slowly. They waited for you to get comfortable. Then they came all at once. He suspected this wasn't the end, just the warning shot. Karen hadn't lost yet. She was regrouping. And Samuel Tracy, for the first time in years, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. 3 days after Samuel mailed his response to the law office, he noticed that someone had taken down the laminated safety sign he'd mounted at the edge of his dock. It hadn't been fancy, just a printed sheet under plastic, stating "Authorized use only, safety equipment required, under adult supervision." But it had been enough to establish a degree of visible responsibility. Now it was gone, along with the small first aid kit box he'd affixed under the railing. The metal bracket that held it was still there, bent at a strange angle like someone had twisted it off in frustration or haste. It wasn't vandalism in the usual sense. No spray paint, no shattered glass, no garbage dumped out of spite. It was surgical, intentional. It had a message. Samuel didn't report it. He took a slow walk back to his garage, found a spare bracket, and quietly replaced the sign and the kit, this time screwing both directly into a reinforced beam with tamper-proof bolts. He said nothing to the kids who had shown up that afternoon expecting to continue rebuilding the older green Yamaha. He watched them for a few minutes, noting how carefully they laid out their tools, how they handed each other wrenches without speaking. The respect they had for the process meant more to him than he expected. It grounded him, reminded him why he'd allowed this to become something more than just his personal refuge. The next morning, an official notice was taped to his front door, not stuffed in the mailbox, not left politely in an envelope, taped with blue painter's tape directly across the center panel of the door, as if whoever placed it there wanted it to be the first thing he saw. The letter was from the county zoning office. It referenced an anonymous report alleging unpermitted modifications to shoreline structures and unauthorized educational gatherings being conducted without safety oversight or insurance verification. Samuel stood on the porch for several seconds, reading it twice, then folding the paper carefully and slipping it into the front pocket of his flannel. He didn't react. He didn't curse. He didn't rip it down. He simply locked his door, walked back inside, and called the county office directly. After 30 minutes of holding and being passed between clerks, he finally reached someone with authority to speak on the matter. The woman on the other end of the line was pragmatic, not bureaucratic. Her tone was clipped, but not cold. She explained that since the complaint had been flagged as safety-related, A routine inspection would be scheduled within the next 5 business days. Samuel thanked her, confirmed the date, and hung up. Then, without wasting time, he opened the filing cabinet next to the workbench and began assembling the necessary documentation. His original building permit for the dock reconstruction, before and after photos, the liability release waiver signed by the parents of the kids who helped him work on the watercraft, and a printed copy of his property insurance policy which included personal injury liability coverage. By noon, he had it all neatly packaged in a folder labeled Inspection Prepared. It wasn't about fear, it was about readiness. The inspection came and went without issue. The official took photos, asked a few questions, and left without comment, though his body language made it clear there were no violations. But the very next day, Samuel found 2 of the jet skis, the ones they hadn't yet repaired, flipped onto their sides. They had been stored under tarps behind the shed, out of view from the road. But now the tarps were missing, and the hulls bore long scratches across the sides as if someone had dragged them over sharp rocks. This time, Samuel did file a report. He didn't expect results, but the point was to create a trail. Visible, documented, official. Later that evening, he received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The message, when he played it back, was from a woman identifying herself as Janice Calloway, a local real estate agent. She said she had a client interested in waterfront properties in the area and wanted to know if Samuel would consider selling. Off-market, cash deal, no contingencies. He deleted the message, then blocked the number. He didn't like coincidences, especially not when they came dressed as opportunity. That night, he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the scratches on the hulls, the way the tarps had been deliberately removed, the precision in the damage. This wasn't kids messing around. It was too focused, too targeted, and that meant whoever was behind it was willing to escalate further. So, he took the next logical step. He went to the local marine supply shop and purchased motion-activated floodlights with infrared cameras, then installed them around the back shed, angled toward the water and dock. He also set up a trail camera at the far end of his property line, where the trees thinned and a narrow deer path ran alongside a neighbor's fence. He didn't hide them completely. He wanted them to be seen, wanted whoever was watching to know they were being watched in return. For several days, nothing happened. Then, on a Sunday morning, one of the neighborhood kids, Micah's younger sister, ran up to Samuel's porch out of breath. She said something was wrong at the dock. When Samuel reached the water, he saw it immediately. Someone had driven metal stakes through the base of the pier, hammered in at an angle from underwater. They were just long enough to catch the underside of a hull if someone launched a watercraft without noticing. A deliberate trap, not an amateur move. Samuel called the sheriff this time. They came out, took photos, filed a report. No promises, just paperwork and polite apologies. But Samuel didn't care about arrests. What mattered was now there was official record of sabotage. Whoever was behind this had crossed from harassment into something far more dangerous. And if Karen was connected to it, even tangentially, then her crusade to reclaim the peace had just earned itself a spotlight she likely hadn't anticipated. That evening, Samuel gathered the kids and their parents. They stood in his garage as he explained the situation in full. No embellishment, no dramatics. Just facts. He showed them the photos, the report, the letter from zoning. Then he made it clear. The lessons would pause. No more rides, no more mechanical sessions. Not until things cooled off or cleared up. The parents didn't object. They understood the risk. But something passed between them in that moment. A recognition. A shared sense of violation. One of the fathers stepped forward, offered to help install additional lighting along the dock. Another offered to replace the damaged hulls at his own cost. Quiet solidarity, spoken not in speeches, but in offers of labor and material. Karen's house, as always, remained lit after dark. No shades drawn, windows glowing with the artificial warmth of chandeliers and wine-colored lamp covers. And yet, the silence around her property was louder than any confrontation. Samuel sat on his porch that night, the wind coming in low from the east, carrying the smell of lake water and fallen leaves. He sipped black coffee and scanned the shoreline through tired eyes. The stakes had changed. The game had changed. It wasn't about noise anymore. It was about control. And someone, probably more than one person, was losing theirs. The lake had grown quieter, but not in the way anyone would call peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hummed with tension just beneath the surface, the silence of people watching, withholding, measuring each other. The kind of quiet that felt less like calm and more like pressure in the air before a summer storm, heavy, unmoving, and hard to breathe through. Samuel felt it the most in the mornings. He would sit on his porch with coffee gone cold in his hand, staring out at the stillness of the water, hearing every creak of the dock as if it were whispering a warning. The motion cameras hadn't caught anything since the stakes in the lake bed, and that in itself worried him more than if they had. There was an unnatural restraint now. Whoever had done it, whoever had the gall and the know-how to drive sharpened metal through a man's launch path, hadn't tried again. They had pulled back, retreated not in fear, but in patience. It was the waiting that bothered Samuel, not the act. Violence you could confront, but silence? That demanded interpretation. It was a move in a longer game, and he knew it. Micah stopped coming around, not abruptly or rudely, just less often. His parents were polite in the way people are when they're afraid of making things worse. The other kids followed suit, and Samuel didn't blame them. The pressure was real. The mood was different. No one wanted to risk being pulled into whatever it was their neighbor was now known for, because that's how it was being framed. Not as a fight for his right to use the lake, but as Samuel Tracy being the problem, the cause, the catalyst. He hadn't done anything differently. He hadn't escalated, hadn't shouted, hadn't retaliated. But that didn't matter. Perception had taken root. He was the man who'd brought trouble, and the community, whether out of weariness or fear, was slowly drawing its lines. Then came the meeting notice. Not a formal subpoena, not an official summons. Just another folded piece of paper, this time placed under a rock on his porch step like an old newspaper, or a message from a time when neighbors still spoke through symbols. The letterhead was from a private mediation firm out of county. The note inside was short. It stated that several concerned members of the lake community had initiated a formal mediation process regarding ongoing disruptions, property use incompatibilities, and safety concerns stemming from Mr. R. Tracy's conduct. His attendance was requested. Not mandatory, not legally binding, but expected. It was classic manipulation, couched in legality, soaked in suggestion, designed to make refusal look like guilt. Samuel didn't hesitate. He scanned the letter, checked the firm's credentials, and then forwarded everything to a small law office in town run by a former Marine who now specialized in property rights and nuisance claims. He had met the man only once at a diner, but he remembered his name, remembered the no-nonsense posture, the way he shook hands without smiling. 2 days later, he had legal representation on paper, a retainer agreement filed, and a scheduled preparation meeting over lunch. He didn't intend to go to the mediation alone, and he sure as hell wasn't going unarmed in the legal sense. The day of the session arrived with a fog so thick it curled along the roadside like smoke. Samuel drove in silence, the toolbox of documents and photos riding shotgun, the air stale with the scent of paper and stale adhesive from the folders. The mediation was held in a sterile, glass-walled room attached to a strip mall business center just off the county highway. Inside, the lights were too bright, the coffee too bitter, and the seating arranged with obvious strategy. Samuel and his lawyer on one side of the table, Karen and her selected trio on the other, with the mediator seated dead center like some courtroom referee dressed in neutral colors. Karen spoke first, naturally. Her voice was smooth, practiced, rehearsed to sound wounded but firm. She described the community's sense of disturbance, the emotional toll, the worry about children's safety, the environmental degradation, and then drifted into talk of real estate devaluation. It was all nonsense, but carefully chosen nonsense. Words meant to echo bureaucratic concerns, to resonate with the sterile neutrality of the mediator. She handed over copies of photos showing the jet skis lined up along Samuel's fence, the kids working in the yard, the moments of activity selectively framed to suggest chaos rather than order. Her allies nodded solemnly, as if watching a funeral rather than a mediation. Samuel waited until she finished. Then he laid out his own materials: the safety certifications, the signed waivers, the recorded inspection approvals, the noise assessments, all of it indexed, stapled, and presented without flourish. His lawyer spoke for most of it, calm and deliberate, disarming each claim with legal precedent and regulation language. When the issue of the underwater stakes was raised, the lawyer leaned forward, placed a photo of the submerged metal on the table, and asked point-blank if anyone on Karen's side wished to comment. They didn't. The silence was thick. But the most decisive moment came when Samuel, without warning, placed a printout on the table, a still frame from his trail camera. The photo was grainy, lit only by moonlight and IR flash, but it showed a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a reflective vest, dragging a tarp across the back of his lot. The timestamp matched the night the watercraft had been damaged. No faces, no direct accusations. But the image said enough. His lawyer didn't even have to interpret it. The mediator merely noted it for the record and asked if there were any questions. There weren't. After the session, no agreement was reached. But that didn't matter. The tone had shifted. The mediator closed the meeting by stating that, absent any compelling evidence of violation or danger, all parties would be advised to discontinue hostilities and avoid unilateral actions that could be construed as harassment or defamation. In plain English, drop it or risk exposure. As they left the room, Samuel didn't look at Karen. He didn't need to. He had seen the change already, in her body language, the way her shoulders had drawn up just slightly, the way her voice had lost its rehearsed ease toward the end. She hadn't expected resistance. She had expected retreat, and now she had to consider what came next, knowing her control was not absolute. Outside, the fog had lifted. The sky was still low, the sun barely punching through the clouds, but Samuel felt the shift. A reprieve, maybe. Not a victory, but something like air in the lungs after a long dive. For now, the lake was his again. But he knew it wouldn't last. The quiet after the mediation wasn't peace. It was strategy. No more letters arrived, no more anonymous notices taped to doors or shoved into mailboxes under cover of early morning. But the silence that followed felt arranged, too neat, like something cleaned up just before a viewing. Samuel didn't relax. He knew the difference between calm and coiled intention. There were no apologies from Karen or her cohort, no gestures of neighborly truce, just an absence of movement that felt less like surrender and more like reloading. Weeks passed. The weather turned warmer and the lake started to wake up. Lawnmowers reappeared. Teenagers on paddleboards glided silently across the water, careful not to make waves, in every sense. Parents walked strollers along the gravel paths again, but the laughter was more reserved, the greetings more cautious. Samuel became a background fixture, not avoided exactly, but not engaged. A silent presence on the shore with a half-dozen personal watercraft lined up like sentries, most of them now repaired and fully operational. He still took the Sea-Doo out on occasion, cutting across the water in slow arcs, never reckless, never loud. But each time, he could feel the eyes tracking him from porch windows and behind half-closed blinds. He didn't mind. He wasn't doing it for them. Then came the complaint to the insurer. It arrived as an innocuous phone call at first, a standard check-in from his property insurance provider, requesting confirmation of his usage details. The voice on the line was friendly but firm, asking if Samuel had recently converted any part of his property into a commercial or instructional space, and if he was hosting public access recreational activities involving minors. Samuel didn't react, didn't challenge. He simply asked for a copy of the complaint. The agent hesitated, then offered to forward the redacted version for his records. 2 days later, the file arrived. The complaint claimed that Samuel was operating a recreational instruction facility without licensing, oversight, or proper liability coverage, posing a credible risk to underage participants and neighborhood safety. Though the complaint was anonymous, the phrasing, again, was too familiar. The tone of a woman who believed bureaucracy was a weapon, not a system. Samuel didn't wait. He called the insurance company directly, arranged a phone conference with their legal review officer, and provided every piece of documentation he'd accumulated. Signed parent waivers, footage of adult supervision during every activity, formal, statements from families, and photos of every posted safety warning. He reminded them, in clear terms, that nothing had been monetized, that all activity was private, voluntary, and conducted on his own property within state legal parameters. The officer took it seriously. She confirmed that as long as there was no revenue, no promotion, and no public access, the policy stood unchallenged. Still, the attempt had landed. A new front had opened. One that didn't involve slashed fuel lines or metal stakes, but would, if successful, cut just as deep. A canceled insurance policy could devastate a man like Samuel, leave him exposed, legally vulnerable. It wasn't about removing him. It was about disabling him quietly. Later that week, 2 of the jet skis were tagged. Not damaged, tagged. Bright red plastic seals, like those used by fire marshals, zip-tied to the handlebars with miniature paper notes reading, "Under review, community safety evaluation pending." They weren't official, but they looked official. They were designed to make someone stop and question what authority stood behind them. Samuel removed them with a pair of shears, stuffed the plastic in a freezer bag, and dropped it in a manila envelope addressed to his lawyer. He knew better than to ignore symbolic moves, especially when they came disguised as procedural gestures. The next escalation wasn't theatrical. It was mechanical. One afternoon, he returned from town to find the drainage ditch behind his garage flooded. The water had pooled beneath the shed, leaking toward the lower storage slope where several of the jet skis were secured. At first he thought it was weather, a flash storm maybe, runoff from the neighboring lot. But then he noticed the drainage grate was missing. The entire pipe had been blocked with a dense plug of hardened insulation foam, the type used for quickset construction fills. Someone had crawled behind his property, pried open the runoff channel, and sabotaged the water exit intentionally. He spent hours clearing it, working until dusk with a flashlight balanced between his teeth and a crowbar scraping mud from steel. When the water finally drained, he stood in silence, staring at the empty pipe and the evidence of purpose behind the damage. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't teens acting out. This was methodical. That night, he installed motion alarms. Not cameras this time. Noise. Bright lights and high-pitched alerts that screamed if someone crossed an invisible perimeter. If they wanted a game of pressure, he'd show them what pressure felt like from the other end. A few days later, the police came. A uniformed deputy stood at his door, polite but clearly uncomfortable. He explained that a formal noise complaint had been filed, not against the jet ski, but against hazard-level alarms disrupting the tranquility of the shared environment. The report stated that the sounds were set off at random hours, disturbing sleep patterns and damaging the emotional well-being of nearby residents. Samuel didn't argue. He walked the officer to the shed, showed him the sensors, explained their function, their range, and, most importantly, their timestamps. Each alert had been triggered only between 2 and 4 a.m., not by animals, by someone moving through the brush where no trail existed. The deputy took notes. His expression shifted. He nodded. Before leaving, he muttered, "For what it's worth, I don't think you're the one causing problems here." The next week, Samuel found the word liability spray-painted in faded white block letters across the side of his dock platform. Not huge, not theatrical, but deliberate. White paint, clean lines, not graffiti, a message. Neighbors said nothing. No one called. No one offered sympathy or pretense. Just silence. So, he made a decision. The following morning, Samuel filed a civil harassment complaint at the county courthouse. It was thin, but not empty. Enough to establish a record. Enough to show that he wasn't just being targeted. He was responding within the system. At the same time, he reached out to the county council and requested to be placed on the next agenda for community remarks. He didn't have illusions about changing public sentiment. But silence wasn't working. Being quiet, being reasonable, had earned him damage, sabotage, and isolation. He wasn't going to wait for someone to take a shot and make it look like a code violation. When the council date arrived, he stood alone at the podium. Karen wasn't present. None of her allies were. But the room had people. Townsfolk, parents, small business owners, older men with folded arms and narrowed eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg for help. He laid out the timeline, the damage, the attempts to force him out through soft pressure and hard tactics. He read off the name of each repair, each filing, each official visit. When he finished, he handed the council chair a folder labeled Community Sabotage Pattern, Tracy versus Unknown. He left without staying for discussion. That night, 2 patrol cars rolled slowly past his home. No sirens, just presence. And for the first time in weeks, Samuel slept through the night. The lake, for now, was silent. But it wasn't over. The patrol cars didn't stay long, just 2 slow loops past Samuel's property, more presence than intervention, but their visibility was enough. The next morning, for the first time in nearly a month, no new damage appeared. No tape across his gate. No paint, no loose hardware. The lake was still, the air thick with summer heat that hadn't yet broken into storm. It was a silence with teeth, and Samuel knew better than to celebrate it. He treated the day like any other. Maintenance, paperwork, oil changes, a slow pass through his security feed to check motion triggers. All normal, all quiet. And then, just before dusk, it broke. The first sign came not with noise, but with light. A flicker from the lower side of the property near the dock. Something moving just outside the view of the floodlight arcs. He checked the feed again, saw nothing but wind. Still, he went outside, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. By the time he reached the path, the smell hit first. Burned plastic, sharp and chemical. Then he saw it. One of the jet skis had been set alight. Not engulfed in flames, but singed deliberately, concentrated at the seat and throttle housing, as though someone had poured a chemical accelerant across a single section and lit it just long enough to warp. The casing. He extinguished the remnants with a garden hose. The ground was scorched, not wide, but deliberate. Nearby, a pair of footprints led toward the waterline. Booted, heavier than a kid's, dragging slightly on the left. No one had entered the house, no cameras had been disabled, but someone had slipped between zones, bypassed sensors, worked fast and clean and gone. It was different now. This wasn't frustration. This was retaliation. Someone had taken his appearance at the council meeting as an escalation, and now the gloves were off. He called it in. This time, the responding officer didn't just take notes, he called for a fire inspector. Arson meant a report. A report meant state involvement. And that meant whoever was behind this had officially crossed into felony territory. The investigator took samples from the soil, the melted plastic, and the burn pattern. He noted the boot prints, took photographs of the trail, and nodded slowly as Samuel described the context. "You pissed someone off real good," the man said quietly, squatting near the burned patch. "Problem is, they don't seem to know when to stop." Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The inspector stood, gave him a card, and promised follow-up once the lab work came through. By midnight, the burned machine was tarped, the rest secured, and Samuel sat on the porch with a cold thermos of black coffee, waiting. Not paranoid. Prepared. 2 nights later, it came to a head. The motion alarm on the western perimeter tripped at 3:17 a.m. No animal. No wind. This time, it was fast. Too fast. A blur across the lower trail, triggering the light cascade and setting off the second alarm near the back gate. Samuel grabbed the shotgun, a flashlight, and his boots, moving without hesitation down the side path toward the dock. The air was humid, thick with lake breath and tension. He moved low, silent, cutting through the darkness in a practiced crouch. Then he saw them. 2 figures, not boys, men, dressed in dark clothes, one crouched near the dock wiring, the other standing lookout near the tree line. Tools in hand. Focused, coordinated. Professionals, or close enough to it. This wasn't neighborhood vigilante work. This was a hired job, someone sent to disable more than property. Samuel didn't yell. He didn't bluff. He raised the light, centered it on the crouching one, and spoke with steady weight. "Put it down. Walk away." The man froze, blinked into the beam. The second man turned, stepped forward fast, something metallic in his hand. Not a weapon, but a tool. Still, the message was clear. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," the second man said, voice calm, almost disappointed. "Neither do you," Samuel replied. Then the sound of tires on gravel. A third vehicle. It wasn't his. It wasn't the deputy's. It was Karen. She stepped out of the SUV like a general inspecting a front line, dressed in a crisp windbreaker and white sneakers that crunched too cleanly on the trail dust. She didn't speak to him. Not directly. She turned to the 2 men and said, "We're done here." The tone wasn't angry. It was final. The kind of tone a manager uses when she realizes the plan has backfired. Both men pulled back, tools into pockets, back straight. Samuel didn't lower the shotgun. "Get off my property," he said. Karen looked at him finally, her eyes unreadable in the beam of the light. "This could have been easier, you know," she said. Samuel didn't blink. "You should go." She did. No apology, no explanation, just a quiet turn, the SUV reversing carefully down the gravel slope. The men followed on foot, disappearing into the dark like ghosts with expensive watches. The next morning, there was a notice at her mailbox. Not handwritten, not folded, official, from the sheriff's office. An investigation had been opened based on the arson incident, motion footage, and witness testimony. Karen's property, now directly linked through vehicle presence at a potential felony scene, was named for a search request. And by noon, the search was executed. A burner phone, receipts for 2 sets of gloves, a trail map with timestamps. Not overwhelming, but enough. Karen didn't return that night. 2 days later, her attorney issued a statement denying involvement, suggesting she'd arrived to de-escalate a misunderstanding between local contractors and a neighbor. But the county had already moved. A restraining order was issued. The association committee scheduled an emergency vote to remove her from any formal or informal position of authority. Parents who had once kept their distance now called Samuel to ask if the kids could return for their last session before school resumed. And one of the younger boys left a note in Samuel's mailbox. A crude drawing of a jet ski, a house, and a big red X over the word Karen. Samuel pinned it to the corkboard above his workbench. That afternoon, he stood on the dock and looked out across the lake. The water flat as slate. The wind still. no movement except the slow rotation of the marker buoy he'd anchored weeks ago. He wasn't smiling, but he was steady, and that was enough. The official report came a week later, slipped into Samuel's mailbox in a plain envelope stamped with the seal of the county office. It was clean, clinical, full of terms like insufficient grounds for prosecution, uncooperative witnesses, and absence of physical linkage to primary suspect. The arson case had stalled. The men who'd appeared at his dock were never identified by name. No fingerprints, no matching faces in the local database, nothing admissible. Karen's involvement had been indirectly confirmed, but not pursued. She had withdrawn from the neighborhood's informal leadership role voluntarily, citing health reasons. The sheriff's deputy who brought the papers didn't look Samuel in the eye when he handed them off. He just offered a short nod and said, "You made your point." Samuel didn't feel victorious. This hadn't been a battle won, not in any formal sense. There were no charges, no confession, no public apology. But the air had changed. Karen's SUV hadn't been seen on the hill for days, and a for sale sign appeared discreetly near her mailbox the following Monday. The listing went live with no fanfare. A short description, no interior photos, just a wide-angle drone shot of the roof and driveway, as if even the camera didn't want to look too closely. By Thursday, the lawn service stopped showing up, and by the weekend a crew had begun packing boxes. It was over in the way wildfires end. Not because someone won, but because the flame found nothing else to burn. The kids returned gradually, first Micah and Daryl, then a few others, walking the trails with less hesitation, the tension in their shoulders replaced with something cautious but curious. Samuel greeted them with fewer words than before, but they didn't need much. The dock had been reinforced, the damaged watercraft replaced, and the markers along the launch zone repainted in fresh white stripes. Everything clean, functional, controlled. He didn't bring up what had happened, neither did they. Their parents stood farther back now, not in fear, but as a kind of loose perimeter, folding chairs planted in the shade, thermoses in hand. They no longer watched Samuel with suspicion or distant tolerance. Now they watched with quiet agreement, the way you watch someone who stood up when most would have bent. One of the fathers, the same man who had offered his garage weeks earlier, approached Samuel during a late afternoon session and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a printed page with over 20 signatures, a statement of support, a request for him to formally establish a registered local youth marine safety group. No fees, no legalese, just backing, community, in ink. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, folded the paper once, and slipped it into his back pocket. Later, he pinned it beside the child's drawing on the corkboard in the garage. The two papers sat there, crooked but anchored like bookends of the summer. The lake itself remained unchanged. Same slope of grass down to the bank, same breeze lifting faint ripples at dusk, same wildlife slipping in and out of view with careful silence. But the feel of it had shifted. The silence was no longer a warning. It was choice. The threat had receded, the tension diffused. People spoke more freely now, not in gossip, but in acknowledgement. They said hey without glancing over their shoulders. They waved again. Samuel didn't let his guard drop. The lights stayed up. The cameras stayed on. The paperwork remained filed and up to date. But the house no longer felt like a bunker. It was a place again. Not just protection, but presence. It didn't need to be a symbol. It just needed to be his. One evening, just as the sun was folding itself into the horizon and the surface of the water turned a deep brass color, Micah rode up to the dock solo. He cut the engine gently, glided in without making a sound, and sat there, arms resting on the handlebars, looking out at the lake. Samuel stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the water the same way. Micah didn't look over. He just said, "Feels different now." Samuel nodded. "It is." They didn't say anything else for a long time. Just let the light fade, the hum of the evening set in, and the peace settle. Not because someone had granted it, but because someone had earned it.